Hi everyone, and welcome to Don't Bank on the Bomb UK's second network meeting. My name is Zara Capassi, and I am the project coordinator for the campaign. I want to start by thanking you all for being here today. It's great to have you joining us to learn more about ethical finance and how we can take action together. So if you haven't done so already, to continue hearing about our events and keeping up to date with Don't Bank on the Bomb UK, please do register to our Google group. You can try scanning the QR code that is on the screen, and we will have the link in the chat soon. So before we begin, just a bit of a quick note. This event will be recorded, but the recording will only spotlight the speaker. So we encourage you to ask questions and share your thoughts. Feel free to drop them in the chat, and after our guest speaker has finished, we'll open up mic access for the Q&A. This will then be followed by a discussion session, which will be chaired by Sarah. So I would like to emphasize that we are really keen for this to be an open discussion. We want to hear from you, learn from your experiences, and work together to build a stronger movement. So please do stay for the discussion and get involved as you are comfortable. So a bit of context to this meeting. I think we're meeting at quite a crucial time. And perhaps how we effectively respond to this is something we can pick up on in the discussion later. But we are continuing to see an increase in defence spending alongside deep and damaging cuts to social resources. At the same time, RF Lakenheath is undergoing upgrades for the return of US nuclear weapons to British soil, which is a concerning development. And Lakenheath Alliance for Peace are actually brilliantly organising action against this right now. States are also withdrawing from core treaties like the cluster munition and anti-personnel mine treaties, and financial institutions are also backtracking on their commitments and choosing to once again invest in nuclear weapons, as we have seen with Allianz no longer excluding nuclear weapons from its investment policies. So in opposition to this, we are taking part in the global days of action against military spending, with a strong and collective message against militarization. So as part of the campaign, Don't Bank on the Bomb UK has launched an open letter to Barclays, Lloyds, HSBC, NatWest, and Standard Chartered. These are the 5 UK banks featured on our list of targets as key financiers of nuclear weapons. So the letter calls on them to end their investments in nuclear arms companies, and we will be presenting this to them on the 9th of May, which is the final day of GDAMS. So please do consider signing and sharing if you haven't done already. Every signature strengthens our voice and puts more pressure on these institutions to really take action. The link is in the chat, or will be in the chat, and you can also scan the QR code that is currently on the screen. So I would now like to move on to our guest speaker. So today we have BankTrack's Max Hammer joining us. So Max is a human rights campaigner at BankTrack, where he has led the organization's work on banks and conflict zones since 2024. His campaigning work focuses on the human rights implications of commercial banking activities in zones of war, and he has conducted a series of investigations and pressure campaigns targeting the investment and financial activities of commercial banks operating in Russia. Max is also a spokesperson and communications lead for the Jewish Palestine Solidarity Organization, NAMOD. So Max, over to you, and thank you so much for being here today.
Brilliant. Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be here, to be able to talk a little bit about BankTrack's work in campaigning and the work of our human rights team, but also to think jointly about, how to navigate this environment, how to build sustainable divestment work at a time where I think divestment work and financial campaigning work more generally is facing a whole host of unique challenges, which I'm very much looking forward to thinking about and trying to work around together. So I think it's a really opportune time to be thinking creatively, to be thinking about new strategies within divestment work, to be thinking about how we can, beyond the scripts and previous types of divestment work that have kind of dominated financial campaigning in the past. And I'm very much looking forward to presenting a little bit about how we've been trying to do that at BankTrack and within the financial campaigners community more generally, but also how Don't Bank on the Bomb UK might approach doing so. So very much looking forward to discussing, very much looking forward to talking a little bit about the work that we've been doing here at BankTrack. I'll be discussing sort of a few main agenda points today, just to give you a little bit of an introduction to human rights focused financial campaigning, what it means, what it involves, what our asks and our strategies are within this field. So first, very much looking forward to going into a little bit of an introduction about BankTrack as an organization, the human rights work that we do, and also the framework that we base ourselves in. So this question often pops up around when we ask banks to respect human rights, what do we actually mean? What do responsibilities do banks have in the human rights space? And how do we ensure that banks uphold those human rights responsibilities? So I'm looking forward to going into that, and also afterwards speaking a little bit about the types of strategies that we use to challenge banks in situations where they fail to fully uphold those responsibilities. This will overlap a little bit with the strategies, I believe, that are elaborated in the campaigners toolkit that Don't Bank on the Bomb UK has put together, but I'm excited also to think a little bit about the variety of different strategies that we might employ within the financial campaigning space. Finally, I'll talk, as I mentioned a second ago, about what I consider to be some of these key challenges that I think are confronting the financial campaigners community more generally right now. I think it's a time where a lot of the previous types of standards and norms that we've relied on and based our work in within the financial campaigning space are kind of eroding, or at the very least shifting. And I think it's a good idea to think a little bit about what implications that poses for our work, but also to look at a couple of examples of how our partners in the UK, but also abroad, might work within this changing campaigns environment and think creatively about how to build a successful divestment campaign in uncertain times. So I'm also looking forward to going into a little bit of a case study of that from what we've learned here in the UK. And then afterwards, there will be time, as was mentioned, for questions, and I'm looking forward also to taking part in the joint discussion myself. So just as a brief introduction to BankTrack as an organization, what it is that we do, what we consider to be our main aims as an organization, I'll introduce here a quick overview that is shamelessly lifted from the BankTrack website. We define ourselves as an international tracking, campaigning, and civil society support organization that targets private sector commercial banks and the activities that they enable through their financing. So when we work, we seek to challenge commercial banks globally to act urgently, decisively, and in a just manner across three main streams of campaigning: on the accelerating climate crisis, on the ongoing destruction of nature, and on the widespread violation of human rights. And you'll see these three areas of our work that are highlighted here form the bulk of our work and also form the three campaign groups through which we organize ourselves at BankTrack. Our team is divided into those who work primarily on banks and climate change, those who work primarily on banks and nature, and those who work primarily on banks and human rights. The human rights team at BankTrack is the one that my work on banks and conflict zones falls into. It is the team that I work within, and it's also the team that I will be focusing on most for the purpose of this conversation, because the campaigning work that we do within the human rights team overlaps with and contains lessons that I hope will be of use for the Don't Bank on the Bomb Coalition as well. As a human rights team, we engage in a fairly broad variety of different projects and initiatives that are mostly based on a sort of overall brief of attempting to ensure that banks respect human rights across the totality of their operations. We have a few projects here that I'm happy to go into. The flagship one of our team is known as the Human Rights Benchmark. This is a report that we issue every 2 to 3 years, which assesses commercial banks globally on the extent to which they've implemented the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights, which is a framework that I will be returning to later and making reference to a few times throughout this presentation. This is the overarching project that we work on as a human rights team, but we also campaign repeatedly and on a recurring basis on specific bank activities where we find that those activities might be contributing to human rights violations. And most of this work involves fighting what we at BankTrack call dodgy deals, which is a bank financing link to any sort of company or any project that has particularly egregious implications for a human rights perspective. We organize a lot of our campaign goals and a lot of our campaign targets around these dodgy deals, and will frequently attempt to help frontline communities affected by certain projects, for example, a coal mine or deforestation work, to campaign against the bank financial ties to that project in order to seek to combat and fight these dodgy deals. Increasingly, though, we also do project work, as I've mentioned, around banks and conflict zones. This is my focus at BankTrack, and it involves essentially any situation in which a bank is active in a conflict zone and as a result might be linked to or contributing to adverse human rights impacts, either through their financing or simply by being active and continuing to operate as a business in a conflict zone. Beyond these different projects, we might, in some more drastic instances, take further action. For example, we're currently working on a complaint to the OECD National Contact Points related to banks' investments in the US private prisons industry. And this is a project that has been ongoing for over a year now. It's a sort of emerging part of our work that I'll go into a little bit later on, where we try and issue complaints and take action to ensure that the regulatory framework confronting banks is tightened and made stronger. So these are a variety of different projects, a variety of different types of work that we engage in that base themselves in different strategies and different ideas. But what unifies them is that we base them all in a sort of approach that primarily grounds itself in international norms. When we want banks to respect human rights across the totality of their operations, we base that understanding of respecting human rights in internationally agreed upon notions of what that would look like and what banks' human rights responsibilities look like. So our norms-based approach as a human rights team primarily draws on two sort of international frameworks that together help define the human rights responsibilities of really a great number of commercial banks and are sort of quite leading within the financial sector. The first of these is the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, which is a very comprehensive document that provides non-binding standards on responsible business conduct across the OECD's 52 member states. There's then a second one, which is the UN Guiding Principles. I mentioned these a second ago. These are more global. They apply not just to the OECD, but to the UN more broadly, and were unanimously adopted by the UN Human Rights Council a few years ago. These, I would say, even more so than the OECD guidelines, form the main document that we base a lot of our human rights understanding and a lot of our understanding of banks' human rights responsibilities on here at BankTrack. And together, these two documents help elaborate a fairly clear understanding of the basics of what we consider to be banks' human rights responsibilities. I've outlined two here that are really worth taking away from. One is the fact that banks have a responsibility based on these documents not to cause or contribute to human rights violations through their own activities. So, for example, a bank should not engage in forced labor or discriminatory hiring practices. In situations like that, a bank's own activities as a business would be contributing to or causing human rights violations. But more relevant even for the financial campaigning and divestment campaigning work that we engage in is this second responsibility outlined here, which is that banks have a responsibility to prevent and or mitigate human rights violations in situations where they are linked to such violations via their business relationships. And a business relationship is any company, for example, that a bank might be linked to as a result of providing financing to that company. So we know that in situations where a bank provides financing to a company that engages in human rights violations, particularly in situations where a bank's financing makes those human rights violations possible, a bank may have particular responsibilities to mitigate or prevent those human rights violations from occurring. So against the background of these responsibilities, we formulate a few clear asks, a few clear understandings of what it is that we want banks to actually do in order to uphold and ensure that these responsibilities are maintained throughout the totality of their operations. We ask banks at the most basic level to comply with the responsibilities and to uphold the responsibilities elaborated in these two documents in full, which seems like it would be a fairly straightforward ask, but you'll see in a second that a lot of banks do not meet the responsibilities that they are upheld to by the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. At the most basic level, what we ask banks to do is to formulate and approve policy commitments to uphold human rights policies. So, for example, as Don't Bank on the Bomb does, we may ask banks to formulate due diligence or exclusion policies that bind them to the human rights responsibilities set out in these international guidelines. What we also do, though, beyond that, is ask banks to follow through on these commitments. Very often, you'll see situations where a bank formulates a policy commitment, but fails to fully implement that policy commitment, or the policy commitment is subpar, or the policy commitment may be very good and may be implemented in full, but a bank's actual financial activities, its actual financial relationships would simply not correspond to the responsibilities outlined in these policy commitments. There is this sort of widespread belief within the banking sector that voluntary standards and policy commitments are enough, both in terms of ensuring that a bank respects human rights and also in terms of ensuring that a bank does not face reputational risks, does not face reputational fallout from failing to actually respect those human rights when it comes to their provision of finance, when it comes to their day-to-day operations. And it's our job as campaigners focused on financial flows to disrupt that belief and ensure that policy commitments are translated into actual policy outcomes. We also ask banks to transparently disclose their policies, to monitor how policies are being implemented, to ensure that the policies that are being upheld are visible for campaigners, or visible for affected groups, and that when we as civil society organizations ask banks about their policies and activities, that banks proactively engage with us and work with us to find solutions in situations where human rights outcomes may be adversely impacted by the activities of certain banks. You'll see below a sort of snapshot from our Human Rights Benchmark 2024. It's pretty notable here. We defined a few banks as leaders too in this case. Even these two leading banks do not uphold the framework outlined by the UN Guiding Principle in full. And in fact, only a handful uphold more than half of the criteria outlined by the UN Guiding Principles. A lot of these banks are very, very good, as I mentioned, at upholding and, or rather at formulating these policy commitments. But when it then comes to actually being transparent, and when it comes to actually extending these policy commitments to their day-to-day operations, some of these banks may be a lot more subpar. And this is really where we intervene and where we take aim at within our campaigning work at BankTrack. We base that campaigning work really in intervening and taking action wherever banks fail to meet the responsibilities that we've just outlined. And given that so many banks still are failing to meet these responsibilities in full, there is a lot of work for us to do, and we have a variety of strategies that we employ in order to attempt to place pressure on and challenge banks to uphold their human rights responsibilities. We have a toolkit of about a dozen or so strategies that we use on a regular basis to ensure that banks do uphold these human rights responsibilities. But for the sake of both time and kind of overview, I'll focus here on four main strands that background and ground the work that we do at BankTrack. So I'll go into speaking about research, the research part of our work, the direct engagement part of our work, as well as pressure campaigning that we do, and this emergent strand based around complaints and regulatory action. So just to start off with research here, a lot of the work that we do is research-based. We are both a research and a campaigns organization, and we place a lot of emphasis on research because we consider to be one of the key issues surrounding bank finance to be opacity and lack of transparency. Frequently, a lot of banks will not make their involvement in a project that may have adverse human rights impacts public. They may refuse to comment on individual clients that they have business relationships to. They may, as I've mentioned before, publicly uphold a human rights policy, but then engage in financial activities that actually fails to uphold or execute that human rights policy. So we spend a lot of time within our BankTrack trying to make sure that a bank's activities become publicly known, that the wider public is aware of the human rights impacts that a bank may be linked to through its provisions of finance. We do this both for a sort of naming and shaming effect, but also to ground our further action to ensure that we have a robust basis into which we can then delve when we are trying to directly engage with a bank, when we try to campaign, when we try to take regulatory or complaints-based action. You'll see here a few examples of kind of different types of adverse human rights impacts that we may have either identified through our own research at BankTrack and made public, or different human rights impacts that other organizations will have identified that we will then help amplify to the wider world. Very frequently, BankTrack will also serve as a sort of repository organization that publicizes research that other organizations have done on the adverse human rights impacts that different banks are linked to through their provision of finance. Among these, for example, you see here are the financial relationships of major commercial banks with nuclear weapon producers. BankTrack is not itself involved in producing the Don't Bank on the Bomb reports, but we have been involved in trying to help circulate them since about 2012 to ensure that they reach a wider audience and to ensure that banks' involvement in nuclear weapons production, banks financing nuclear weapons production is more publicly known. After research, I think it's good to speak a little bit about direct engagement as a tool that we engage with, both because it's a very important part of the work that we do, but also because the Don't Bank on the Bomb toolkit mentions it as a cornerstone strategy and a very, very important part of the work that you ambition to do. We have a really long history of direct engagement work. We very frequently will raise human rights issues that banks are linked to with those banks directly. I would say this makes up a very large portion of the work and of the campaigning activities that we do. And in fact, almost all of our campaigns will start off sort of with a letter to a bank that queries them on their financing of a certain company or a project and raises the human rights issues and impacts that are inherent to the bank's financing. And you'll see a whole host of examples on the left. There are really a much wider variety of this, but this is just a few examples of different human rights impacts across the world that we have raised directly with banks and engaged with them on directly to ask them to stop their financial, to end their financial ties to these human rights impacts. But it's important to note here, based on the graphic on the right as well, that this direct engagement work rarely ends up being all of the work that we do. Even in situations where we point out that a bank's activities might violate its own policies, direct engagement alone will often not lead that bank to stop its provision of finance for a activity with adverse human rights impacts. These findings, which come from our 2024 human rights benchmark, again, indicate that out of the 229 banking inquiries that we sent out between 2022 and 2024, 145 received a response from the bank, but only 25 actually ended up resulting in a bank taking action to respond to or address the harm that it was contributing to. So direct engagement can, in some cases, lead a bank to take action, and it's often a very, very important part of a wider campaigning toolkit, but very rarely can direct engagement with a bank end up being the end of our campaigning work. And that grounds and is the result, or rather results in the fact that we end up taking a lot of time also to mount public pressure campaigns against banks, which is often a sort of escalation of the direct engagement in situations where the direct engagement alone does not result in a bank dropping its financing for a certain problematic project or company, a certain dodgy deal. We engage in public pressure campaigning really for two main reasons. One is to kind of take a direct action to protest or in some cases disrupt a bank's activities, and the other is to creatively force those banks' activities into the public light to ensure, again, that a bank's adverse human rights impacts are more publicly known, because our protest might ensure that it gets a little bit more attention than it otherwise would have. One of BankTrack's main campaigning tools here involves supporting frontline communities, any community most affected by a project, to ensure that banks hear directly from the people that the project that they are helping enable affects most. For example, we will often help a frontline community attend a bank's AGM to ask a bank's executives questions about the activities that they are linked to, or we will help a bank write an open letter to a bank to query them and inform them of the adverse human rights impacts that their work is having. But we'll also often take a series of more sort of disruptive and or public-facing actions. You'll see on the right here, this is a photo from a action that BankTrack was involved in just 3 weeks ago, where we disrupted on the inside and protested on the outside the Raiffeisen Bank International Annual General Meeting over its ties to both the Russian government and Russian companies involved in sustaining the war on Ukraine. We will also, beyond these direct engagements, try and help customers and other stakeholders, such as investors, in amplify or engage in pressure campaigning towards banks that are involved in adverse human rights impacts. So, for example, we will engage in social media campaigns, we will help set up divestment campaigns, we will help set up open letters and get involved in a whole bunch of other strategies that involve streamlining and magnifying the impact that individual customers or individual investors who are upset about their bank's involvement in adverse human rights impacts can have. Finally, I want to go into the final emergent strategy. As I mentioned, this is one that we use a little bit less frequently than some of the others, but it's still worth talking about briefly as an area that has recently taken up a little bit more of the human rights team's work than it has in previous years. So beyond kind of engaging with banks directly and beyond kind of trying to affect the activities of banks through our campaigning and public pressure work, we also engage directly with regulators and contact points to attempt to influence their activities in order to ensure that the regulatory framework confronting financial institutions is made more robust, and that in situations where banks are engaged in adverse human rights impacts or linked to adverse human rights impacts, they face appropriate responses and appropriate action. We do this through a variety of ways. One is by engaging with regulators directly. So, for example, the European Commission recently has attempted to gut the Corporate Social Responsibility Due Diligence Directive, CSRDD, which is a proposed framework to sort of strengthen the human rights and corporate social responsibilities of a wide variety of companies, including but not limited to financial institutions. And we have engaged directly with the European Commission to attempt to convince them not to gut this proposal. But we also file complaints in situations where there are bodies responsible for overseeing bank compliance to ensure that banks face consequences in situations where their activities might be particularly egregious. We've, for example, as I've mentioned, filed a complaint with the OECD national contact points in the UK and Switzerland over bank financing for US private prisons, but also are in the process of filing one to the Austrian National Bank over bank investments in Russia. Whoops, sorry about that. Having now, gone into a summary of sort of our current strategies, I also want to talk, as I mentioned, about some of the limits of these strategies, though. Because, as I mentioned, this is a particularly difficult time for the financial campaigning space. And although these 4 strategies make up a lot of the work that we're doing currently, we are facing new and unexpected challenges that have implications for the strategies that we use, but may also have quite important implications for DBOTB's attempts at building up this campaigning work currently. And there are a variety of reasons for this being a particularly challenging time right now. Especially in divestment work related to the defense space, but I just want to go into a handful here. So the first one here, and this was mentioned a second ago, is the kind of changing tone that a lot of people, both in the banking sector, but also more broadly, are striking with regards to the defense sector. A lot of banks have gone from at least a little bit of wariness around defense spending to an active encouragement of it, but this is also mirrored by policymakers. You'll have seen in the UK, even a few weeks ago, over 100 MPs in the Labour Party signing a letter asking banks actually to ramp up their defense spending, to backtrack on previous ESG policies in situations where they deem those ESG policies to be too strict on defense spending. So, given the fact that banks right now are actually facing a push to up their defense spending, this is or their financial ties to the defense sector. This is a key challenge for campaigners who take aim at the defense policies and the exclusion policies of banks that finance activities and companies operating in this sector. Another challenge facing us at the moment is the fact that, despite, as I mentioned, the fact that a lot of voluntary standards and policies adopted by banks may be subpar in terms of their implications for financing, even these voluntary standards right now are in many cases being gutted. A lot of banks are retreating from previous climate alliances, from previous policy commitments, from previous human rights implications or human rights standards that they may previously have signed on to, in part because we see that a lot of banks may currently be less concerned with reputational impacts and less concerned with public fallout than they used to be a few years ago. And a major reason for that may also be, and this ties into this next point, due to a global shift towards really towards the political right and towards a weakening of frameworks that govern and may previously have restricted business conduct. There's been a push, as I mentioned, for banks to loosen their ESG policies, not just in the defense sector, but more generally. And although that often comes from banks themselves, it also increasingly in situations is coming from policymakers. We're seeing this especially in the United States, but we're also seeing it in countries like the UK, in the European Union, and elsewhere. And all of that means that trying to strengthen regulation, trying to engage with banks directly, trying to appeal to international norms or to a business case for human rights is increasingly an uncertain recipe for successful campaigning. We're finding banks to be less concerned about the impacts of their activities in these situations, about the reputational fallout and the regulatory fallout of their activities than they've ever been. And this poses really important implications for the divestment work that we do at BankTrack, but also the divestment work confronting any financial campaigner. Now, that being said, there are still examples of successful divestment campaigns, especially in situations where divestment campaigners have started to get a little bit creative with their strategies and have started to look into new ways for campaigning, new ways to engage directly with banks, new ways to apply pressure on banks, new ways to bring in stakeholders into the mold in order to ensure that reputational fallout can still be a factor that banks have to consider when they consider who to provide financing for. I'm using an example here from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in their recent work targeting Barclays over Barclays' financing of Israeli war bonds, Israeli weapon suppliers, and Israeli settlements. I'm using this example, although it's not from our own work, because it's UK specific and thus specifically relevant to the conversation we may have, and also because it concerns Barclays, who aren't just a major financier of a variety of Israeli war crimes in relation to the ongoing genocidal war in Gaza, but also one of the main banks named in the most recent DBOTB report, and so thus one that we may want to consider as well in our sort of strategic thinking and in our planning going forward. So the Palestine Solidarity Campaign launched a campaign against Barclays in 2023, and it was really a quite opportune time where there was this upswell in public attention to corporate complicity in Israeli war crimes as a result of the escalation of the war on Gaza after the October 7th attacks in 2023. And Barclays, as a result of this kind of upswell in public support, used a quite creative approach that differed quite a bit from the direct engagement approach that a lot of other financial campaigners may be using. They used what could be said to be a more oppositional or a more aggressive approach than a lot of financial campaigners would often use. Less of an emphasis on direct engagement and much more focus on research, on a variety of protest actions, as well as nonviolent direct actions, and increasingly also on boycotts. They spent a lot of time encouraging customers as well as sponsors to boycott Barclays over its ties to a host of adverse human rights impacts linked to their relationship with Israeli weapons manufacturers. And this work has proven to have quite demonstrable impacts, although Barclays still maintains a relationship with a lot of the clients that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign takes aim against. The campaign has had notable results that are detailed just in part here. Several key sponsors have ended their relationship with Barclays as a bank, and Barclays itself has also taken decisive action in divesting from the Israeli arms manufacturer Elbit. In one case, although they didn't end up following through, Barclays actually planned to withdraw from Israeli bond auctions as a result of the adverse reputational impacts that they were facing as a result of their involvement with the ongoing Israeli war on Gaza. This campaign is still ongoing and efforts are underway to pressure Barclays into taking further steps, but it is worth thinking about this campaign and the ways in which it may differ from previous financial campaigns. And I think it's worth thinking about this jointly when we go into our conversation. What does this changing environment mean for our divestment work, and how might it provoke us to think more creatively about the strategies that we employ? I've listed just a couple of questions that we may want to consider jointly here, but they really are quite a few that are raised by the ongoing kind of changing normative framework, as well as the increasingly creative strategies that some campaigners are using to get around that work. Thank you very much. I hope that this has been useful, and I hope that that the work that BankTrack does, as well as the kind of changing circumstances that we are facing within our work, may also provide lessons to Don't Bank on the Bomb. And very much looking forward to the Q&A and to thinking together with you about this in just a second.
Max, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. I definitely learned a lot, and it's really great to hear all the work that BankTrack is doing in this regard. I will now open up the floor for questions, but also if you have any thoughts on the questions that Max just put up on the screen. Max, maybe if you can keep them up on screen for if anybody does want to have a think and respond now. But if you would like to pose a question or comment or even a response to one of these questions, please feel free to pop your hand up or to write a question in the chat. Sarah, hello. Sorry, I just have to say, if you I can't, because we're sharing screen, I can't see everyone's videos. If you just pop up a hand using the function that's around, that would be great. But Sarah, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's a fantastic presentation, Max. Thank you so much for your time and for such a thoughtful, I feel like, through line of a lot of the thinking that we've been doing within the campaign as well. The question I had was kind of, I guess, yeah, from experience within BankTrack, just how successful or what has your experience been in the use of those like guiding principles, the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines, as like lever points, I guess, for like trying to influence banks who more often than not from I guess my limited experience, but like the experience I've been hearing a lot about from more experienced campaigners is like banks saying, well, right now the UK specific government isn't signed on to, say, the TPNW, for example, and so we don't actually need to follow maybe more international or like internationally recognized kind of principles as that. And I wonder, if you have reflections on like the kind of ability to engage with banks directly, or even to just, I guess, like any other targets you have, be that sponsors or like people who are customers of those banks, using those kinds of more like global or international frameworks.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question that is especially relevant for our work, given how heavily it does base itself in these international frameworks. I think it's worth not being, naive about the ability for these sort of voluntary standards to have a decisive impact on the activities of banks in every case. I put this question up here around the business case for human rights and whether it's still worth holding on to. And partially because I'm somewhat biased against it, because I find that banks increasingly are finding that even in situations where they do not respect human rights, they are still able to, flourish as a business, particularly in situations where these voluntary standards are not going to be, or where they see no reason that those voluntary standards are going to translate into regulatory outcomes, where they see no reason that the voluntary standards are going to translate into reputational fallout. So there are certainly limits to this approach, and I think that we should be realistic about those limits and face them head on. That being said, I still think it's worth maintaining an approach that bases itself in these voluntary standards, simply because they are quite straightforward in elaborating a responsibility that banks have that allow us to base our continued direct engagement with banks or continued campaigning work with banks in something that is quite concrete. So when we engage directly with banks, we have something to reference when we say these are the responsibilities that you have to uphold. When we try to do research about a bank's financing and its adverse human rights impacts, we have something to reference when we say this work is not just sort of nebulously bad, it is not just nebulously sort of morally abhorrent that a bank is involved, for example, in financing a project that has significant adverse human rights impacts for frontline communities, but also the banks are violating certain responsibilities that they have that are internationally agreed upon. And additionally, what we find on a more macro level is that the human rights benchmarks that we've been doing for quite a few years now, although they are certainly not to a point where we would like in terms of the fact that not a single bank still has implemented the UN guiding principles in full, there has been gradual improvement continuously since we started doing these benchmarks. And I think this is really where the kicker comes in. There is still a sort of race to the top within this industry. There is still a willingness for banks to improve their performance across these types of standards in situations where it is commonly understood that they have a responsibility to act on them. And this is something that I think that we can learn from, even in situations where individually pointing out a bank's human rights responsibilities in one specific case may not get it to drop its financing for a specific project. Using them as a tool as and where they are useful, using them as a tool on the macro level and using them as a tool to inform different types of strategic engagements that we might undergo, I still think has a certain level of merit, although we should be aware of the limits of it.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? I also realized that I myself had lost the hand up function, so I am checking all the videos. Yes, Elizabeth.
Yes, hello, thank you. And thank you very much for the talk. Could you make any specific comment about the nuclear weapon side of the bank investment, which all of us here are particularly interested in?
Yeah, sure. Specific comment on banks' human rights responsibilities, specific comments on the types of strategies that may be useful for this type of work.
Well, as you mentioned that, both of those would be very interesting, please.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'd be very happy to reflect on this a little bit. I mean, in situations where where banks have agreed upon policies related to human rights, for example, where banks have agreed at least to structure their activities according to UN guiding principles, there are certainly cases to be made around using that to engage with banks on the basis of their provision of finance to nuclear weapons. I would say the DBOTB UK toolkit is quite useful in elaborating some examples of situations where even continued engagement, even if the weapons are unused, engaging in finance and providing finance to producers of nuclear weaponry may contribute to or link a bank to adverse human rights impacts. And so this is something that I think is worth teasing out and continuously basing ourselves in when we attempt to directly engage with banks that are linked to nuclear weaponry through their activities. But also when it comes to some of these strategies, I think it's worth thinking creatively, specifically about how to ensure, how to bring people in a public pressure campaign in a way that ensures that banks actually feel like they have something to lose when it comes to financing for nuclear weaponry. So going back to the example that was used a second ago, one of the things that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign did that was quite novel was target sponsors or organizations that were sponsored by banks over the fact that these banks were continuing to provide finance to companies that were involved in Israeli aggression in Palestine. Whether or not that's transferable one-to-one to a situation where banks are continuing to provide finance for nuclear weaponry is I think something that is worth thinking about more broadly, and probably not be answered in one kind of conversation. It's something that needs to be tested, I would say. But it's worth thinking about situations like that. It's worth thinking about strategies like that. Whether or not there can be a concerted campaign to get people to change their banks, whether or not there could be a campaign targeting major institutional investors that, for example, themselves have policies related to nuclear weaponry, but might invest in banks that do not have policies for nuclear weaponry. Pointing out these types of contradictions, finding pressure points, finding situations where there are relevant stakeholders that might feel strongly about a campaign, and then bringing those stakeholders in order to maximize engagement with a bank and maximize pressure on the bank is, in our experience, as well as in the experience of other financial campaigners, something that is increasingly quite effective in terms of streamlining the pressure. And I think, for going forward, and this is probably going to tie a little bit into the conversation that we will have jointly in a second. But I think going forward as financial campaigners, it is really worth thinking about, what types of communities, what types of stakeholders might have a vested interest in getting one activity or the other to stop. What types of stakeholders may be particularly concerned about nuclear weaponry, and how can we reach those stakeholders, and how can we be involved in streamlining the activities of those stakeholders so that they maximize the impact and the pressure that a bank feels when it actually feels that it has something to lose over its continued financing for companies that continue to produce nuclear weapons. I hope that goes at least a little bit of a way towards answering the question.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Actually, I think you make a really interesting and good point there. So currently, we have been looking at this from a customer level. So people that choose to use these financial institutions, be that banks, pension funds, investment management funds. And as a last resort, we have been calling for people to divest themselves, so to change their providers. And we have been focusing on how conversation is more effective rather than just withdrawing, because it doesn't promote change in that way. But maybe rechanneling the idea of banks having something to lose beyond just customers might be a strategy that we take moving forward. Because I know there has been a conversation as to what are people, like on a grassroots level, actually willing to do, but we don't have to just look at a grassroots level. We can look at it at all levels. And thank you. I think that's a really good food for thought for us as a group. Michael, I see your hand is up as well.
Hello. Unmute.
We can hear you.
Okay, good. I had first to Max, thanks for the really thought-provoking presentation, and hopefully we can look at this as the beginning of an ongoing dialogue and not just a one-off opportunity to pick your brain, because there was a lot in what you had to say. I'm going to make a few comments, and then maybe Max could react to some of my comments rather than a pure question. I was struck by the three areas that your campaigners work sort of siloed off, even though they're related, obviously climate and was it deforestation is the second one?
Yeah, destruction of nature, which is deforestation and other
Yeah, and human rights. And I was struck with the clear intersectionality with issues around nuclear weapons and all three of those. Whereas I don't think the nuclear disarmament movement in the UK has had a lot of direct impact with you guys, though correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly the few of us that are here from MedAct and from Don't Bank on the Bomb Scotland and Don't Bank on the Bomb UK haven't really thought much about what BankTrack does before. So that's really useful. What I wanted to point out is that you do some work on reacting to dodgy deals and things like that, which is brilliant. But in the nuclear space, it can only really be prevention needs to be the message. There's no way to react after the fact with nuclear weapons. And that's something that we need to continue to think about, how we can interact to get a large number of people involved. As Zara just said, the classic, if that's the way to put it, approach with Don't Bank on the Bomb in terms of the PACs and the international Don't Bank on the Bomb has pretty almost always been to initially engage as from a consumer point of view or a bank account holder point of view and try to change the policies of the bank and then divest at the last resort. But one thing that the international Don't Bank on the Bomb movement has had success with in terms of billions of pounds or dollars worth of divestment has been the issue of pointing out stranded assets and with the belief that the banks are very concerned about that. And though I can't prove that, but it just makes sense that they would be. In the UK, that's specifically important because the UK will say we haven't signed up to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, therefore we don't need to worry about these issues. And they've actually clearly said that in the past a few times, I think now. And yet, in countries that have signed the treaty, there's been big strides forward in terms of divestment. So that's one point I would make. I'll stop soon because I can always bring up a few other things. But the other question I had for you is, you talk about a human rights perspective all the time, and in the nuclear space, we're usually talking about international humanitarian law. And I'm not sure if you see that being like a intersecting Venn diagram, or if they're the same thing or different in your mind. So I'll stop there for now.
Brilliant. No, thank you so much for your comments, and I think they're really sort of thought-provoking and useful for me to think about some of these issues and how they overlap with our work here as well. Just to kind of structure it for myself, I'll first respond to the bit about the overlap between climate, nature, and human rights work, then speak a little bit about this question around stranded assets and the question around banks feeling like they don't need to commit to policy standards that the regulatory environment that they are in does not commit to. And then finally around this kind of question around human rights and the extent to which it overlaps with humanitarian law. So to get started around this point around the connections and separation between human rights, nature, and climate work, you're right, of course, and I portrayed this for the kind of sake of simplicity of the presentation as much more siloed than it actually is within our work at BankTrack. So the teams that we have at BankTrack very frequently overlap and interact with one another, and often will find themselves working on the same projects jointly. Something like half, if not more, of the dodgy deals that we work on within the human rights work are dodgy and have adverse human rights impacts, specifically because of their environmental impacts. So a lot of the human rights work that we do, for example, is based around iron mines or lithium mines or oil pipelines that, in addition to displacing communities, also has adverse human rights impacts because of the environmental and climate impacts that they have on the frontline communities that are most affected to them. There's a lot of overlapping links there, and this goes into conflict work as well. Most of the companies that are, or most of the banks that are active in Russia or in Israel are often financing the energy sector in ways that is destructive, both from a human rights and a climate perspective. So you're absolutely right that there is a lot of connections between the different kind of themes of campaign work that we do at BankTrack, and I think it's worth thinking through this from within the context of nuclear campaigning as well, because as you mentioned, there is really a kind of overlap between all three. When it comes to this point about the regulatory environment and how to frame this as something that is preventative rather than getting banks to stop financing for an adverse human rights impact that has already taken place. There's, I think, actually quite a few lessons to be learned from the work that we've been doing around banks that have been active in Russia, and the kind of situation that a lot of those banks find themselves in now that may transfer or may be useful for the work that you're doing in this space, particularly when it comes to stranded assets and changing regulatory environments. A lot of the banks that are active in Russia right now remain active in Russia because they spent close to a decade ignoring the warnings after the invasion of Crimea in 2014 and saying, you know, as long as the regulatory environment doesn't change, as long as there is no kind of overt sanction on our activities in Russia, we're going to continue operating as normal. Most of those banks, if not all of those banks, saw their stock crash by something like 30% on the day of the invasion in 2022. They had like billions of dollars in stranded assets that they now can't recover from a market that has been completely isolated internationally. A lot of them had to essentially give up whole portfolios of investments that they had made within a different context. You know, high-risk sectors and high-risk investments and high-risk environments don't stop being high risk just because the regulatory environment that a company or a financial institution is operating in has also decided to subject itself to higher risk. The fact that the UK isn't a signatory to TPNW, the fact that there are banks that may not currently be facing regulatory reprisals as a result of their investments in certain high-risk sectors does not mean that that situation may not change in the future. And I think this is a point that is worth pointing out directly to financial institutions, because there is inherent risk involved in investing in sectors like these that expose banks to a whole host of international treaty obligations, even if they are not directly subject to them. And pointing that out and framing it in the terms of financial risk is often something that financial campaigners may not, or that financial institutions may not be used to coming from campaigners. But it is something that we've seen as, at the very least, sometimes having an impact on the way that banks think about their investments in particular high-risk sectors. And nuclear, I would certainly describe as one of those sectors. Into the final point about human rights versus international humanitarian law. You're right. I think that they are not a neat overlap. I think there's a Venn diagram. I think there's a lot of interaction within them, and particularly in the conflict zones work that we do, you know, that bases itself equally in human rights, but also in international humanitarian standards. I think there are overlaps and differences, and one of the main differences may be, you know, how you define exclusion policies based on sectors that may be subject to the legal requirements of international humanitarian standards versus sort of weaker due diligence policies that base themselves in human rights norms, which often are a little bit weaker than humanitarian standards. Humanitarian law raises all these questions around complicity and legal obligation in a way that a lot of the time for businesses, at least, human rights law doesn't. But you know, that's a kind of wider differentiation that may be worth kind of going into in a bit more detail later. I hope that kind of at least answers the question partially. And yeah, I appreciate the comments. They've been really useful for me to think through as well.
Thank you so much. Just picking up on your last point about human rights and nuclear weapons, there has been some work going on regarding this within the UN circles as well. I know a few states have made statements about the threat of the use of nuclear weapons being a threat to human rights. And there was also the Human Rights Council resolution, I want to say a couple of years ago, about nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands and the impact of those nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. So I think there are some procedural links being developed, but I do think it's still quite early on, although it is definitely an area that the disarmament community are trying to get into, simply because the disarmament machinery is so clogged up in that way that they often find that the Human Rights Council is a better route to go down, although I think it's still quite early days and there is a lot of pushback on that, but something to definitely consider and track in that regard. do we have any final questions before we can kickstart our discussion? Well, if you do end up having any questions, I'm sure we can raise them during the discussion. But for now, I will hand over to Sarah to chair our discussion and for a little chat about how we can keep this campaign going and make it a more sustainable initiative. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you so much, Max, for your excellent presentation once again and answering all those questions in a great amount of detail. So really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zara. And yeah, thanks so much, Max, as well, for all of your reflections. I think it's going to probably lean a lot into my presentation now. So it's going to be just like a quick few slides, hopefully to provide some context to, I mean, what I think a lot of us will already understand to be like MEDAC's approach to campaigning work and campaign strategy. But essentially, yeah, we've touched on a lot of this already, I think, with Max's reflection. So thinking about the potential opportunities and obstacles that the group might be having to consider in the run up to I guess, like, yeah, having this campaign fully hit the ground, both political, economic and social kind of considerations. Maybe the social one is the one that's come up in previous network meetings around what are the kinds of frequently asked questions that individual customers and consumers might have about divesting, about different banks and the kind of like world of investments and divestment campaigning. But the political and economic considerations, I think we've touched on quite a lot already. Yeah, I just wanted to have like maybe a quick question, and feel free to either unmute or to drop into the chat. But does anyone have kind of reflections on what makes or what might make a sustainable divestment campaign specifically? And I'm intentionally not defining sustainable, I guess, just so we can have like a few ideas to springboard off before I then delve into my MEDACT approach. And also, I can't see hands, so please do unmute if you have any reflections.
I would say actions that people are willing to take and that can be carried out over a longer period of time rather than just being a one-time click a button and that's your limited engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's probably something that everyone in this room especially has thought about, but the ability to have long-term action and have it be something that people feel able to consistently engage with, have it feel something people, I guess, feel invited into, and don't burn out from, I guess, for lack of a better word. Any other reflections? If not, I'll continue on.
I would come back to the point about the sort of balance between a variety of different approaches that involve, maybe more conflictual approaches versus more conciliatory direct engagement approaches. It's not easy to kind of maintain a divestment campaign that also relies on interacting with the financial institutions that you're trying to work with if a campaign is so conflictual that it immediately burns that bridge kind of straight off the bat. So thinking through the ways in which these strategies can complement each other and be used jointly is, in our experience, pretty useful in building a campaign that lasts.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point, and one that I think I haven't thought as much about in terms of like framing the work both as, or framing constituent parts of the work both as operating potentially more in conflict with the targets that we have, and then also working with them. And I think we've had examples from other partner organizations shared with us about different ways that campaign groups have encouraged banks to kind of formulate their own smaller groups of, I guess, like coalitions who have, who I guess assert themselves as having higher standards ethically, morally, or whatever kind of policy standard they hold themselves to. Again, that kind of leans into the reputational angle that we might want to be influencing these targets using. But that's a really good point. And I'll shift on now just for time. But yeah, our approach to campaigning, this is, and again, everyone in the room has probably seen this before, but is really similar to BankTrack's in that we do our health justice campaigning work through both research and evidence-based campaigning. So the research we have, I think, is informed by a wide range of organizations who have gone before us, Don't Bank on the Bomb, PACs, etc., having done a lot of the groundwork in terms of research in the current context. But yeah, using that as the kind of grounding for all of our campaigning work is what we do. I'll skip over the side around health justice because I think we probably have a grasp on it, but essentially the last line saying that we want to name and disrupt the conditions that produce mass ill health and suffering. And I think constantly trying to communicate that to people who come into our campaign and grounding our nuclear disarmament and nuclear abolitionist work in that understanding of these weapons being something that we have to, as Michael I think pointed to, actively prevent the use of, not respond to. I think that's like a really grounding point in our work. There are three key concepts that I just wanted to kind of frame, I guess, Medac's or approach to campaigning around. One is power. And so, as we've mentioned already, we have a very social approach to power. We want to engage with our movement in a grassroots way. We want to empower people to consider the power and the levers they already have with the financial institutions they have relationships with, but also form this mass kind of collective that hopefully Don't Bank on the Bomb UK can provide an umbrella for, wherein we can have greater impact than we can alone, and we can challenge the kind of monolithic approach to power that, you know, a lot of the other approaches to campaigning work, both in this area and in a wide range of issues as well, takes as its approach in terms of speaking to one decision maker and hoping that they affect change. We want to think about actually disrupting that approach and having more social approaches and understandings of power. We're also thinking about solidarity, so I'll briefly touch on this one, but just thinking about and it's been touched on, I guess, as well, but like the myriad intersecting movements that are, I guess, working alongside us as nuclear disarmament campaigners, and thinking about, okay, who are the affected communities? Who are the kind of like groups of people who have been doing similar work? How can we be in solidarity with them? And how does that then strengthen our movement too? We've thought about this a bit with the partner organizations we work alongside, and also within our kind of toolkit, trying to frame the work with a real grounding in the history of, say, like nuclear testing and the impacts that that's had on specific communities globally as well. Our theory of change, I think we've spoken a bit about already in a previous meeting anyway. I've definitely shown this image before, but it basically summarizes what I've said around coming together, working in solidarity, and trying to do that pressuring of institutions collectively to try and to affect change across the different campaigns that we have. I'll skip on so that, I wanted to basically propose a secondary question to ask people in the room, when outside potentially of the divestment space or the nuclear disarmament campaigning space, have you taken action to try and address an issue you are facing? So that could be big, it could be small. And I guess I'm trying to maybe highlight any obstacles you encountered. Was it with a neighbor? Was it with a friend? Was it with another campaigning or community group? And why is it memorable to you, I guess? If you do have any that come immediately to mind, please do again, just unmute and jump in. But if not, I can also provide an example from my own experience. Michael?
One example, can I? Oh,
yeah, go for it.
One example going back quite a few years would be the success of the anti-poll tax movement that I was very involved with something called the Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign to defend the people that were arrested in Trafalgar Square, and I think it was close to 500 people arrested, and that campaign developed to give unconditional support to the people arrested, and was highly interacting with the general UK anti-poll tax movement, and with sustained activity over a number of years, the poll tax ultimately was withdrawn, and some would say that the anti-poll tax movement caused the government to collapse, which I would have said was a good thing at the time, or I still say that. So having said that, what made it successful was big numbers. not just big numbers
Mm,
in a defendants campaign, but as a UK-wide movement. And people in all areas of the UK were involved, and young and older people were involved.
mm,
Can't pay, won't pay was one of the slogans. And that, so a simple slogan caught the national mood. Uh, and not just the mood, but the practical reality of what was happening in the country. Not unlike
mm.
not unlike some of the crises we're facing now with cost of living and things like that. But how do we get a movement like nuclear disarmament to start to have that same impact? I still think there's a big issue that we need to reach out to the climate change campaigners, and I'd be interested in what Max might even have to say if he's still with us. I can't tell who's here and who's not. Um, and we need to continue to try to do that, both in Scotland and in the rest of the UK.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, just to say that just quickly, that's a great example. And I think the kind of aspects you highlighted of like huge numbers, really strong messaging that felt collectivizing, but also specific to like you said, like groups of young people, groups of old people, and it felt applicable to their own context. I think that speaks really well to probably a wide range of successful mass movements. So yeah, thank you for that. And I'll also come to Elizabeth, and then if anyone else has any reflections, please do jump in. But Elizabeth, go for it.
All right, just two quick examples. About every 10 years or so, our local health services are threatened here, because we're a rural outpost, if you like. And we've got the district hospital that's the furthest away from its nearest neighbour of any in the UK. So on one of the threats a few years ago, somebody in the powers that be mentioned red lines, and this was picked up locally by the population, led by people who were campaigning for our health services, were very well informed, and said, right, well, we form a red line around the hospital.
Mm,
And people turned out, well, in hundreds, I should think, to make a line right round all the hospital premises and down the main road and so on, joined together with red ribbons and having red posters. And we really think that did have an effect.
mm,
It was such a community response. So again, that's local numbers pulling together. On a different scale, Mikhail Gorbachev actually did say, I mean, there is evidence of this, that in meeting with international physicians for prevention of nuclear war, in an international context, actually did influence him towards his moves forward on trying to limit numbers of nuclear weapons. So from the local to the international, if you like.
both really great examples. Thank you, Elizabeth. And I think the first one also is really striking because it has that kind of a strong image or symbol, similar to the slogan, I guess, but something that is really visible to people. It's in the local community. It's addressing the specific target. It's site specific, and also I imagine as well people who are just walking by suddenly now have an awareness of what the issue is from that visual. So, yeah, thank you so much for that example.
And yeah, you're right. It does also bring that visual image, which and people still wear red shirts, in connection with it. And also, it's very easy for the press and the media to pick it up. They've got things to take pictures of, and putting forward a relatively simple message, not trying to spread it too wide. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you so much. For the sake of time, I'll shift on just so that we can get on to, well, actually, we've just fed back, so I can skip on from there. But what do we mean when we say campaign? I think we probably all have a relatively strong understanding of what a campaign is, but for the sake of just summarizing it, people coming together to take strategic action on an issue, aiming to bring about change. And obviously there are different other associative kind of words that come to mind, like advocacy, organizing, mobilizing. And we've tried to have quite a specific and clear definition of all of these different kind of words distinctly, so that we can then, I guess, articulate what our own approach is more clearly. So obviously advocacy, we're thinking about some of the things we already do, the individual conversations and the meetings and speaking directly to decision makers in support of a cause. Organizing, which I guess is an increasingly used word, especially in recent years amongst campaigners and organizers, speaks specifically to around what we're talking about. So building power within communities locally and at a grassroots level, so that it's not necessarily only about taking that action collectively, but it's about building the relationships within a space, like you were mentioning about those local actions, so that people have a shared politics, a shared set of skills or experience, and the capacity for ongoing struggle, which I think that's the thing that oftentimes when I'm also talking to a lot of Don't Bank on the Bomb UK working group members or like members of the nuclear weapons group is the most difficult part of, you know, sustaining people's engagement, maintaining those relationships, having people feel like they have a sense of identity associated with a campaign. But yeah, that's organizing. And then mobilizing, we're thinking about probably the most self-explanatory one, but getting large numbers of people out to a specific action or event. And, you know, that can be a protest, that can be a direct action. Increasingly, it's also digital actions as well. But yeah, all of that is to say that at MedAct, I think we've decided organizationally over the last few years across our different campaigning work that our campaigning is very much organizing centered. And so the approach we're taking with Don't Bank on the Bomb is as such. So we're trying to think about building power within communities locally and at a grassroots level, but also in light of, I guess, the presentation we've heard today from Max, like what actions these communities can take doesn't just have to be held locally. It can also be thinking about key stakeholders that our targets or target financial institutions have. It can be thinking about the I really like the idea of like sponsors or like sponsees, I guess, for those financial institutions, and essentially where we can use our organizing base to apply pressure to those different targets. But yeah, hopefully that is a helpful way of articulating our approach to campaigning. The very last thing I want to introduce, and I'm going to skip over this because I think we all understand what strategy is, but is this campaign cycle, which I think probably at our next network meeting, we're going to have dedicated time to fleshing out a bit more. But I just wanted to introduce at this meeting, especially as we're thinking about creative ways of taking action, and we're thinking about, okay, as a campaign group, how are we going to take sustainable action together? We also have this image that was developed from the Patients Not Passports campaign within MedAct that we've been trying to and have applied really successfully, I think, across different campaigns. So basically illustrating that the campaign that we have is not linear. It's not like it has one specific endpoint, and it's not as though we're going to move, unidirectionally towards that goal. It's oftentimes quite an iterative process. It's cyclical. It's, you know, a consistent like moving through recruitment, engaging, making our demands and escalating. And sometimes, you know, also maybe not even in that order. Sometimes it depends on the capacity in the group or where the energy is. But I think it's a useful frame potentially if people haven't seen it before, to hopefully ground our work as a campaign going forward. So some examples of like attempts to recruit, engage, demand and escalate have been spoken to, I think, and a really great example from the Palestine Solidarity campaign's Boycott Barclays campaign that Max spoke to as well. Is just thinking about ways that, number one, we can expand our organizers and build allies. Number two, take action with these people so that we're engaging them and they care more deeply about the issue and feel a sense of like association and identity with the campaign. Then articulating the demand, which is usually in the first instance a very simple task. So drafting them collectively and you know, communicating them in whatever way, shape or form to the targets we have. The open letter that we have, I think, is our first kind of like attempt at iterating communicating those demands to 5 of the worst offenders in the UK in terms of banks. But then the most, I guess, the part where a lot of the creativity often comes from is the escalation. So oftentimes, as we know, the demand is rarely just listened to with an open heart and mind from these institutional actors. So there are various ways that we might escalate. So taking action to increase the pressure and eventually win those demands. These are just a few examples that came from the Patients Not Passports campaign, and are a bit kind of like focused on our Medact memberships kind of site and space. So think about hospitals, healthcare spaces, etc. But we can think also about the context that the Don't Bank on the Bomb campaign will be in. So like, where might we recruit people from? How might we engage them? How might we articulate those demands? And then how might we escalate in a creative and engaging way? There are three things that we usually try and invite people to like brainstorm collectively, which I think we'll do maybe in a future meeting, either in a network meeting or a core working group meeting. But one is kind of thinking about the allies we have. So we think about like, not just us as Don't Bank on the Bomb UK, but I think what's been spoken to a lot today is the other kind of movement actors that we're in solidarity with or in community with. So climate organisers, people who are organising against arms broadly within the UK, people who are organising around these issues globally or internationally or in other national contexts, and thinking about, okay, how do we either, if they're already on our side, move them closer to our potential kind of like position, or engage them with our work, or, you know, help them to realize that we have a shared demand and maybe they can also amplify our demands as well. But also, if there are people or organizations or actors who have completely opposite interests to us, i.e., I think one example that comes to mind are some policymakers in the UK, not all of them, but some, who are really committed at the moment to encouraging the kind of like loosening of guidance for financial institutions and banks in particular around their investments, and saying that, you know, defense companies, manufacturers, etc., arms manufacturers should be considered included in their ethical investment policies, for example. I would say those people would be positioned maybe towards the opponent side of things. And the task there is maybe not thinking super actively about them, but thinking about ways our strategy is addressing them to quieten them, to isolate them. I think that's also like a practical part of campaigning work. The second bit is something I think we've done quite a lot of in terms of the thinking over the years, and have gleaned a lot from other movements, is like mapping the pillars of power, we like to say, which underpin a kind of regime or status quo. So in the case of, I guess, banks, pension funds, financial institutions, who are the kind of like people who are upholding the continuation of their stance on nuclear weapons investments. And again, that might be policymakers who have a real interest in you know, the shifting political climate towards the right, increasing conversations around hard militarized approaches to defense, etc. It might just also be people who are really interested in a kind of like approach to, I guess, like the economic landscape that is purely, I guess, like, yeah, capitalist, and not interested in the human rights arguments or moral arguments or ethical arguments around the responsibilities for these institutions. But yeah, there's some brainstorming that we can do together, I think, collectively, to try and identify maybe some of the key stakeholders, some of the sponsors, some of the pillars who are influenceable, or who are able to influence ultimately those target financial institutions that we have. Obviously, there are definitely policymakers who are potential allies in that work as well. So we should think about the obstacles, but also the opportunities there. Finally is just like tactics. So I've put a big list at the bottom, but usually the most fun and engaging part is thinking about, I guess, what we keep coming back to is, how do we take creative action together in a way that communicates our demands really clearly, but also galvanizes a movement, makes it feel really exciting, makes people feel committed to it, and also makes it really visible. I think like some of the examples that were raised earlier were really visible, really grounded in kind of like a simple action people could take, but also that allow them to feel invested in the campaign. And yeah, there's so many options for us. So I think those are essentially the kinds of things that we encourage groups to think about. And I think probably we'll have more space to discuss collectively what specific tactics the group might want to take on. But if there are things, I guess, that have come up either from examples that have been shared today, or examples that have been, we've seen, I guess, like other movement allies, partners have or do, that the group are really excited about, I think it'd be good to hear, actually, and I might stop sharing my screen. So I've also been talking for quite a while now. Yeah, I might stop sharing my screen just so that I can hear if anyone does have kind of like a leaning towards any particular kind of action or an action that they think might contribute to that kind of sustainable campaign cycle situation. It can be big or small. And I will stop talking as well because I'm conscious, Zara, that we have like 4 minutes left, and I want to have space for other people's reflections rather than my own.
Well, I think a lot of it boils down to time and energy. So I wanted to ask Max, how many employees does BankTrack have, either full or part-time, if any, and how is BankTrack funded?
We're a fairly small team. I think it's 13 full-time staff, as well as at any point somewhere between like 3 and 5 interns, and funded entirely by organizational grants. I myself am funded by a grant from the Open Society Foundation. We take grants from climate foundations, human rights foundations, similar organizations.
Thanks, Max. Hopefully we can talk more about the specifics of that at another time, maybe with Sarah and Zara, something like that.
Hope so too. That'd be great.
I think that is some food for thought, actually, is keeping the campaign going with funding. I think it's not a conversation that people really enjoy, but it's one that's quite necessary. I think it's one that Michael and I were having with Phil the last time we spoke as well, where we have really great ideas, but to see them come into fruition, we do need a bit of money. And then there is that issue of where does this money come from? Again, we are a divestment campaign. It needs to be clean money in that regard. But then I know in the disarmament world, there are a lot of conversations happening where, or even you're seeing it happen, where a lot of campaigns are repackaging themselves as think tanks to be more palatable, to be more receptive to funders in that regard as well. But then at the same time, for a campaign like this, you need to be disruptive to see results. So I think there is that issue that perhaps we can explore in a future meeting as well, is where do we find the middle ground? And another point is also, I know Susie Snyder has been working on this, but it's also about being very clear about where the funding is coming from. Again, in the disarmament world, a lot of these think tanks and institutions are funded by companies that have an incentive in keeping the arms trade going. So it's that you are being censored in minute ways, which have a bigger impact. So those are just 2 quick thoughts I wanted to put out there for a bigger conversation, hopefully in the future.
They're really good points, Zara. And just off the back of that, they made me think about and I'm not sure if you've spoken about it in lots of detail, but the collectivizing of our demands with other movements. So like, I think we've seen, or in a similar way that we see like maybe banks positioning themselves as ethical banks or like more ethical than others and forming these kinds of like groups or like, units to kind of signify their difference. I think there's something potentially, or I don't know how successful it could be, but I'm thinking a lot about like how to connect with groups like Palestine Solidarity Campaign and like fossil free like campaigns and stuff like that, so that there's maybe some way of clearly communicating a core demand on banks and financial institutions that is cross-cutting. And obviously there's a lot of tensions there because, where one provider might be really great on one issue, they might be really horrible on another. But I think that increasingly I'm seeing maybe there's more power in that kind of like unification. And I'm interested actually in hearing what other people have to say about that, because one risk of that is the kind of like loss of the nuclear weapon specific argument in this kind of like mass claim for like, I don't know, ethical finance, which isn't a very snappy slogan, but do you know what I mean? Like something really unifying. So yeah, I'm interested, and we've spoken a bit about the next network meeting being one where we invite other organizations who have been doing campaigning work using divestment to come and share a bit about their experience too. So whether that's an idea they've had, whether there's any like power or potential in that, despite the obstacles and the potential like problems with it, would be something that I'm keen to think through with the group a bit more.
And related but separate issue would be I'm increasingly concerned when I hear about the number of Labour MPs that are being influenced to buy into this increased defense spending. And I would hypothesize, again, with no strong evidence, though I think people are looking into it, that there must be a huge amount of lobbying going on by the defense sector down south and up north, and how we can counter that effectively becomes a question to think about. And I think Max has his hand up.
Yeah, Max does have his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to feed in on that on a similar point, bringing in also and responding to what you said, Sarah, about trying to build a kind of broad-based coalition on work like this. This kind of push towards renewed enthusiasm for defense spending and such like a radical shift away from what, a center-left government should be doing, I think is kind of quietly angered a lot of people, especially people in the constituency organizations that you mentioned, fossil-free campaigners, Palestine solidarity campaigners, all of these groups I think are pretty concerned and dismayed by that. And there is a lot of cross opportunity to work with these groups, I think, on a kind of push against this increasingly broad-based consensus towards increased defense spending and the increased kind of pressure that or the increased encouragement that banks are receiving from the government to up their defense financing. I think if there are links to be made with other organizations, it's definitely along that axis. It's definitely along the axis of resist this push towards increased remilitarization, both in the nuclear space, but also within the kind of space of financing for weapons more generally. So it may be worth thinking about that as a coalition, how to frame that in a way that maintains the core of demands around nuclear while still creating links with other organizations.
Thank you so much. I am aware of the time, so I apologize in advance to everybody that we have gone a bit over time. Everything that has been said in this discussion, we have noted down, and we hope that we can bring this into bigger discussions and meetings that are dedicated to delving into this a lot deeper and fleshing out the campaign and really going beyond the one action that we have so far, which is the open letter, and kickstarting this into a truly nationwide campaign. So on that note, we do have our next network meeting on the 3rd of June. Sarah, please nod if I am correct on the date. I think I am. But before that, we are hoping to actually invite everybody to a working group meeting where we can focus on discussing strategy and taking this conversation into a more practical outcomes. So taking us outside of the typical structure of a network meeting into a purely discussion and strategy chat. We are hoping for the end of May, although the date is to be confirmed. So we will send out an email to everybody with the date as soon as we can confirm it with our working group. And invitations will go out pretty quickly with the registration link. But I am also just going to share my screen as a final closing with my typical, please scan all the QR codes and sign up to everything. So here we have the QR code for our toolkit, which we launched at our last meeting last month. And the middle QR code is for the open letter. So as I had mentioned, this is for the Global Days of Action Against Military Spending. The Global Days of Action end on the 9th of May, and that is when we are hoping to send this letter to all the 5 banks. The aim is to send it to the head offices of the 5 banks and to also send it to all the branches that we can get a hold of. But everybody that signs will receive a request on the closing date to also send it to their branch managers. So hopefully we can get a conversation going at various levels and to make a bit more of a noise than if it were to just go up to the head office and potentially be ignored. And the final QR code is to join our Google group. So we have finally kickstarted the Google group, and we are hoping for it to be a space to share different ideas and have different discussions outside of the meetings on a thread system. You can also join to stay up to date with events, any actions, any other ideas or initiatives that are going on outside of the campaign that might be interesting for people that sign up. So please do scan that QR code and join the Google group. I think I see a pop-up, so I think Sarah's popped them all in the chat, but we will also be sharing all these links around in our follow-up email. So on that note, I would like to say thank you so much to both Max and Sarah. I think both of your sessions were very informative and very, very, very helpful to the campaign. We all know that Don't Bank on the Bomb UK is quite young, and we are looking for many ideas and lessons on how to make it a longer lasting campaign. And I hope we can take forward everything we've discussed and learned today to really make a difference. So on that note, I will say thank you to you both, and thank you to everyone for attending and for giving us your evenings. And yeah, I hope you have a good evening and take care.